Hello and welcome back to Bridge the Gap, our podcast about involving young people in research, one episode at a time. My name is Sadia and I will be one of your hosts for today, and I'm also joined by a co-host.
Hello everyone, this is Faiqa.
In our last episode, we talked about the different types of involvement and a lot of the words and concepts we use to describe involvement. Today, we're going to really get into a concept we brought up in our last episode, lived experience, what it means and why it's important.
And to help us today, we're joined by Andrew Grundy, a lived experience researcher here at the University of Manchester. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi everyone, really nice to be here.
Oh, really nice to have you. So Andrew, let's just get straight into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a lived experience researcher, mainly based at the University of Manchester. So I use my own experience of psychosis and using psychosis services to inform all of the research that I get involved in.
Okay, really, really cool. There is a little bit of maybe confusion amongst the audience about what actually is lived experience. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and touch upon what is this concept that we talk about?
It's a weird one, isn't it? Because we all have experiences and we're all alive. So
I should hope so.
Yes, I'm hoping I'm assuming the listeners are all alive. But yeah, so someone might say, "Oh, I experienced the war." A grandparent might say, "Oh, I experienced the war." Now that could mean they simply just lived through the war years, right? They experienced it at that level, or it could mean they were in the trenches, the bombs were going down all around them, it was really scary, and it was that level of experience. And that's really what lived experience means, is the experience is like really lived through, like deeply, richly experienced. So it's this idea then that those of us that have lived with a mental health condition, live through using services, that can make a real difference to research in particular.
Right, really interesting, because I think in this room we can all say that we've got lived experience of COVID, of an actual pandemic, but actually not all of us have actually experienced being ill with COVID, right? So I guess that kind of makes a lot of sense there. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Just wondering, Andy, is lived experience the same concept of experts by experience?
Yes, I think it is, in that but the experts by experience bit is emphasising that notion of expertise, that actually through living through something and living with something, that you gain knowledge and insight that is really useful. And so in a sense, you do become an expert in what you've been through and how that's impacted you.
Where is the line between lived experience and experts by experience?
So I'd argue that anyone who has a form of lived experience is gaining knowledge and insight through that experience. And the more that you learn and the more insight that you gather, that does kind of give you a form of expertise, a kind of form of you do become an expert in your own experience, the impact that it's had on you, and how you kind of convey that to other people in a meaningful way.
You described yourself as a lived experience researcher. What does that mean?
That's some really lived experience researcher. Sounds really, really interesting.
Yeah. We're a little bit of a rare breed, I think, at the moment. So with involvement, it's always been argued that the kind of highest level of involvement that you could have is that someone with lived experience is involved right from generating the ideas of a research project all the way through to, designing conducting that study, and then producing, communicating your findings at the end of the study. And so essentially a lived experience researcher then is someone who is in that kind of role. So I'm employed, I have a university contract, or it might be that you're doing that in an involvement role still, where it's not salaried, but you're still being reimbursed on involvement terms. So you can still be a lived experience researcher with an involvement hat on. But it is all about bringing your lived experience and applying it to the research process. So there's something about the skill in applying your perspective and your experience to the research so that you're both informing how that study is designed, but also how it's carried out as well.
And is there anything that you need to know before becoming a lived experience researcher?
I'd argue that people with lived experience need training and support, ideally from a lived experience researcher, so that they can really understand what it means and how you go about applying your lived experience in a meaningful way to research. So there's something about picking up research knowledge and research skills, but the step that's often missing is, well, how do I actually apply my experience to what I'm learning? And so there's something about helping people to do that, to develop that skill, because it is quite a skill, because you're often disclosing and sharing it can be quite sensitive things. So in my own research, for example, my PhD was looking at psychiatric inpatient risk assessment and risk management, and what it was like for people on the wards to experience being risk assessed and risk managed. Now, I've had a number of inpatient admissions myself, and I was using that to inform how I carried out that study, how I designed that study. It also gave me amazing rapport with my participants as well, like that sense of connection. But there's something it can be quite distressing, like reliving past experiences and using that to inform future research. So there's a sort of skill in supporting people to do that well and making sure people feel safe and supported to be a lived experience researcher. So, yeah, it's complicated.
I mean, I myself have seen firsthand your passion in facilitating training for lived experience. I believe we went to Liverpool for a training session, and it was just really insightful to see not only that connection between you and those in the training, but how supportive and open that space was. I can really understand that it's about trust and not like re-traumatizing people, but allowing them to use their experiences in a way that is both healthy for them, but also helpful to others. And I know we've touched on it a little bit, but I guess I'm just really curious about your experience in becoming a lived experience researcher.
I sort of crashed out of life for a few years. I mean, psychosis completely overwhelmed life for a number of years. And I was attending a mental health day centre. And my key worker there said, I've got this flyer, and it's all about this training course that someone at the University of Manchester's running. And they want to train up some service users and some carers in research methods, with the possibility of maybe getting involved in some studies. Like, is this something you might be interested in? And I went back to my wife and I said, what do you think? She said, it looks really boring. And I said, well, yeah, but they're paying people to attend. And she was like, right, go for it.
Yeah,
So,
it's all about the incentives.
Exactly. So initially it was basically just something to do to get out of the house, get a bit of money, try and find a bit of some meaningful activity again. But actually, I loved that course. Like, it kind of reawakened a whole load of intellectual kind of curiosity that had lain dormant for so long. As a result of doing that course, I was invited to get involved in a project called Equip, which was looking at how service users can be involved in mental health care planning and care plans. Because what we were finding is that although it's kind of best practice guidance that people should be involved in their care plans, we're not. And so there was something about bringing my own experience of being under a community mental health team, my experiences of poor care planning, bringing that to that study. And it's kind of gone from there, really. So I've been involved in various other studies. I've done my own PhD. I'm now working on a project where we're exploring the hunger side effects of antipsychotics, because that's a massive issue. We don't really understand the nature of that experience very well. We don't know how people want to be supported with that. And again, that's something I've experienced firsthand. So that gives you a kind of sense of my journey. You're always wearing two hats. So you've got the researcher hat on and you've got the lived experience hat on. It's sometimes really difficult because your researcher credentials are questioned because you've got lived experience. So I went, say, to a research ethics committee once where they said, oh, hang on, so you're a service user and you're going to be managing consent and patient data? Like, can we really let you do that kind of thing? So it's something about, am I a real researcher because I've got lived experience? On the other side of the coin, I've got a PhD and so some people think I'm too professionalized and therefore they question, am I a real service user? And so there's the challenge of navigating that. And that brings its own distress, like how you manage that invalidation. Yeah, navigating that is difficult.
It does sound incredibly difficult. And if it helps, not only do you have the credentials, you're now on our podcast as well. So you're definitely a researcher.
Recognition, yes. Thank you so much.
Yes. But Andy, how do you deal with these challenges? Because they sound really tough.
So every researcher gets supervision, and that can be really helpful. But that's often academic supervision. So it's more, that's the deals with my researcher hat, but it doesn't always deal with the lived experience hat. So I think it's really important that we find other lived experience researchers because we know best what this feels like. We have lived experience of being a lived experience researcher, right? So there's something about that kind of peer support is really helpful. And I've really valued just where you can kind of process that invalidation, distress and disclosure. There are other dynamics as well. So things like, what do you do when you suddenly find out that that participant who's agreed to be interviewed is someone you knew from an inpatient ward admission or from another service? Like, how do you navigate that? What if you discover that the professional that's going to be in this focus group is someone who's previously delivered your care or that you know from that kind of... So, and those are the kinds of things that other members of the team might not think are going to be issues, right? So there's those sorts of issues to navigate as well.
Do you have any top tips on how to navigate those situations that I feel like an everyday researcher might not even think twice about?
Preparing yourself for distress. And that can be difficult because you can't always do that. So, for example, when I was doing interviews with carers for the Equip study, I wasn't actually prepared for the fact that carers were sharing things about how difficult and how burdensome it is supporting a service user. And the first time I did that, that was a real kind of shock to the system because I'm suddenly hearing and thinking, oh my life, I am such a massive drain on my family. We can't always prepare ourselves for what's going to come. But I think it is about, as much as possible, thinking through, okay, well, I'm about to enter this study, this maybe interview. What are the kinds of things we're going to be potentially talking about? What does my diary look like after this interview? Like, have I given myself sufficient space to process, or have I given myself enough space to at least switch off, or being able to talk to someone else? So there's something about thinking ahead, and then there's also something about, once you've done it, ensuring that you're looking after yourself well, and that you've got people to talk to if you need to.
This is really, really eye-opening. I've been so quiet because I've been really, really thinking about everything you've said. And I think one thing we know that this happens is after a participant has been part of a research, there's always sort of post-research period where the help is sometimes provided to the participants. But I haven't thought about it from a researcher's perspective. Like, perhaps, do they need any help after the study has taken place?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even what you might call kind of traditional researchers who, they don't have lived experience, but they can still get upset and distressed and traumatized by what's shared in an interview. So I'd argue we all need that kind of help and support. But there's something about a lived experience researcher's kind of closeness to the topic that brings its own kind of sets of challenges. It's that, it can be that rawness, it can be bringing back painful memories, painful experiences. And so I think lived experience researchers in particular need kind of targeted help and support. And again, I'd argue the best people to do that are other lived experience researchers.
So, do you believe that young people should care about this concept of lived experience, and how difficult really is it for them to navigate?
Absolutely, young people should be encouraged to bring their lived experience to research, and I'd even say encouraged to consider coming into the research world and becoming lived experience researchers themselves. I think people can be quite patronising, can't they? I think young people kind of get the raw end of the deal sometimes, because, people think, well, how much lived experience do they really have? They're so young.
Yeah, like how old are you really? And then you're like, oh well, I'm only 18. And you're like, really?
Yeah, but there's that kind of, they don't really have that much lived experience, that much wisdom, that much insight. But that's such a kind of patronising way of looking at things, really. I mean, the whole thing about lived experience is that, it's rooted in what we go through and the things that happen to us and the impacts that they have on us. And of course, young people are going through so much in terms of navigating the school system and online, harassment, and the world is completely different from when I was your age, and that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
Well, you might want to debate that.
Young people should really get involved because they can then see research through a lived experience lens, and actually I think it would help them to provide a more empathic approach to how we speak to participants, but also how we interpret data, and even maybe potentially a different understanding than the researcher of what the participants are actually conveying. But Andy, what is the most important thing we discussed today? If you had one piece of advice.
Oh, he's really thinking there.
Like to leave the last question till last.
Get your thinking hats on, not the research and not the lived experience. We need the thinking hat.
I think the most important thing is around the value of lived experience when it's kind of understood properly, and the difference that lived experience can make to research, and really, really valuing that as a form of knowledge and expertise.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us on this episode and for answering all of our questions. We've talked a lot about involvement, but in our next few episodes, we're going to shift and we're going to talk about how to actually do research. So things like research questions, variables, research designs, and really getting into the nitty-gritty of quantitative and qualitative research.
Ooh, exciting things coming up.
Exciting things to move on to. Thank you so much for listening on Bridge the Gap. Join us next time. Like, follow, and subscribe, and check out our socials.